is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two warring souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals, in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-consciousness, manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self.
W.E.B. Du Bois's conception of double consciousness explores the impact of dominant cultural cues on members of minority subgroups. Echoes of double consciousness can be found throughout African American social schemas. These remnants of doubleness are not subtle coincidences, but rather direct reflections of the time. A primary example of double consciousness, its practical implications, and psychological repercussions would be African Americans' use of code switching. In the past decade, African American vernacular English has become a contested issue. AAVE is more commonly referred to as Ebonics. Its validity has been scrutinized for several reasons. Perhaps one of the major concerns regarding the issue is its role in the classroom.
Really, I think most Americans are not knowledgeable about the origins of this language dialect, depending on which term you prefer to apply to it. I think perhaps the incident that occurred back in the 1990s in Oakland, California best illustrates that point. There was a case involving the Oakland School Board whereby members of that organization publicly drafted a resolution stating that they intended to educate public school teachers in the Oakland school system about the language that we call Ebonics, or African American Vernacular English, or Black English, depending on the terms that scholar or individual prefers. And in that particular case, the news media sort of ran away with the story and talked about how in the Oakland public school system, the school board was implementing a program designed to teach Ebonics, which was a gross misrepresentation of what the school board actually intended. Instead, what the school board intended was to acknowledge and recognize that many African American children actually come into the public school system speaking this language that we call Ebonics. There had been studies in the past to illustrate that those students who spoke Ebonics were having difficulty learning in the classroom, primarily because they had problems translating from what we call Black English or Ebonics to Standard American English.
Educators strive to teach impressionable youth the grammatical and technical points of standard English. Unfortunately, this has become a struggle for many teachers who encounter students who have not had consistent exposure to these language cues during their early developmental years.
So I'm aware of that, but I think you need to put it in context for students. I think you need to say that the language of power, the language of money, is how you go out and get a job, and how you need to speak, and how people will always look at you in a certain kind of way. And I think another way, going beyond language, is how you dress, how you look. For my son, he sometimes I think he speaks better English than I do. He's a really good writer, but I always told him, when you walk out the house, you iron your clothes, because people will judge you that way. So people will judge you the way you look, people will judge you the way you speak. So I think we need to let our students know that there are different ways of speaking in terms of code switching. When you're with your friends, you talk this way. When you're in a classroom environment, you talk this way, but not negate the language that they speak.
I think looking at it from looking at the whole K-12 system and into higher education, that just from a policy perspective, that we really do need to look at students' backgrounds and the environment that they are raised in, and incorporate that into the learning of the classroom, and not particularly discount their ideas and the thoughts behind their ideas when they're expressed in Ebonics form, but use that as a tool to kind of a jumping board to transition the students into learning standard English also. So I think that would be a good perspective for the K-12 system to adopt, so that when students reach higher education level, that they are they're able to compete with their peers and succeed.
Ebonics has traditionally been viewed as a dismantled version of Standard English, rather than an independent form of expression. As a result, Ebonics speakers are often taught to suppress these inappropriate speech patterns and other linguistic variations in order to acquire proper means of communication. However, some linguists and educators have begun to examine Ebonics in a new light. Many suggest that Ebonics is a dialect, even a language in its own right.
One of the other interesting aspects about languages and dialects is that the difference between a language and a dialect is often very subjective. Linguists treat a dialect as something that can still be understood by speakers of another dialect. So speakers of two different dialects of English, we say, can still understand each other. So we say that dialects of a common language are mutually intelligible. And the point at which two dialects become different languages is the point at which those speakers can no longer understand each other. So what we have to keep in mind is that languages are constantly changing, or evolving, if you will. And when over time languages are constantly changing, and eventually two dialects that start to separate could eventually become separate languages at the point where they are no longer mutually intelligible. So this is sort of the relationship between a language and a dialect. But of course there are other sort of political overtones to the definitions of dialects and languages.
You may not see as many vocabulary terms retained, but you will see grammatical rules about syntax, such as the ways in which you order the words in a sentence. They follow many African rules. It's very common. You can also see in the uses of verbs, for example, in many West African and Central African languages, and these are the regions from which African Americans first migrated. But among these languages, for example, Africans tend not to use double consonants very much. It's very unusual to do that in an African language, but particularly in these regions. So when Africans arrived to the Americas and became exposed to English and other European languages, they would usually have difficulty pronouncing words that incorporated double consonants. An example of that is the TH. For example, in the word mother, an African speaking the English version of that term may say mudder, okay? It would come out with a D sound. You can see that also at the beginning of a word. Example may be the word there. They may say there, okay? Also, for example, in other parts of the world, you can see this sort of retention from Africa. I'm thinking about the word pork. You may have heard older African Americans use the word poke, okay? And so they have difficulty still to this day, many African Americans. It's not true of all African Americans, but many African Americans still have problems with that double consonant. And this is particularly true among young children who have not been perhaps exposed as much to standard American English because of the language that was spoken by their parents at home. And it doesn't mean that African American parents may not have attempted to teach those their children standard American English. But they themselves may not be very familiar with it, particularly if they're not college educated. Those who are middle class and college educated may be best able to transmit that standard American English to their children. And most parents recognize that it is useful for their children to have this knowledge because in the dominant culture in the Americas, and able to get some of the best occupations and to have access to some of the institutions of power, you need to be familiar, at least familiar, even if you don't speak it in your everyday life.
I use standard English when I write papers for school, when I have what I call the voice they pay me for, and that's what I use when I'm at work. And I use Ebonics when I'm with many of my friends, but typically with friends of color or white friends who grew up in predominantly Black or predominantly Latino neighborhoods. I think I'm more comfortable with them and using Ebonics around them because they understand what it's like to be in the minority in a place where somebody else is the majority.
In a society where the dominant discourse is perceived to be white and rewards and privileges are connected to the dominant discourse, African Americans may consciously perform whiteness or blackness to meet their needs.
And as we know in the United States, there are other factors that play into people's views of languages and dialects. And anthropologists talk about cultural capital, for example, the idea that the language you speak gives you certain advantages. The language you speak may give you advantages in terms of getting a job, getting a better education, being recognized by other people in your discipline, in your class. And so we tend to associate language, the type of language that you use, with your social class. And of course, when a particular racial minority speaks one variety of a language, then that tends to isolate them in a certain way, which creates discrimination and racism. So this is why I think that Ebonics or African American English have been so charged in American history, is because they conjure up images of racial stereotypes, and they allow people to judge people based on the way they speak. And this obviously has very profound social and economic consequences.
Constant criticism through formal education, media, and socialization reinforces the notion that Black English is bad and that good English is mandatory for success and for survival.
There are some people on this campus who feel like speaking Ebonics is shameful, and they feel it reflects badly on their whatever their intellectual, capacity is. And so they pride themselves on not speaking Ebonics, and so they may look at you differently if you speak Ebonics, or make jokes, oh, stop being ghetto, ha ha ha, whatever. So I feel like part of the reason they do that is because they want to meet this standard that they feel they have, and they want to really, quote unquote, fit in, kind of with the status quo that is very present here on campus. So to them I say, and I hope you're watching this video, whatever. I'm keep on speaking Ebonics. I love it. And yeah, so that's what I think is going on with that.
Exploring language cues amongst African Americans reveals important aspects of African American culture. The notion of double consciousness is still a prevalent and acting force in the formation of African American identity. The values placed on languages are directly correlated to the values placed on the people who opt to use them. Two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body. The internal upheaval continues even today. Individuals who practice code switching should realize that Ebonics is indeed a credible form of expression. As Sarah Jonesberg states, speaking Ebonics should not evoke shame or elicit correction. Rather, it should evoke pride in the speaker and admiration in the listener.